Our next interview is with the new president of the ABAA, Sarah Baldwin of E. Wharton Books. And Sarah, we're going to start you off with the same kind of question I start everybody off on. Tell us a little bit about your family background, where you come from, what education you have, siblings, etc. Bring us up through your college years. Sort of a 2-minute biography.
Well, that may be more complicated than you think, because in fact, I was born in New York City. My parents were Boston bred, and by the time I went to college, I'd been to 13 different schools.
Right.
So from New York, I went to Watertown, Ohio, and from there to Duxbury, Massachusetts, to Winchester, Massachusetts, to Greenwich, Connecticut, to Minneapolis, Minnesota, to Reading, Massachusetts, to Arlington, Massachusetts, and all the schools along the way.
What did your parents do?
Well, my father was an attorney, and my mother and father separated and divorced when I was 5. My dear mother, who was an extremely bright and vivacious woman who had gone to Radcliffe, in fact, married 5 times. And when she died and we had a service for her, my sister, in describing my mother, included in her written remarks that my mother was married 5 times, and all to Harvard men.
Wow.
And
all right.
As vivid as that made my mother appear, I did suggest that perhaps that might not be entirely appropriate for this particular service. But in any case, I was fortunate to come into a family that was educated. My grandmother went to Elmira when it was still very unusual for women to go to Elmira. She was an English teacher. She was an antiques dealer. My grandfather on my mother's side was an electrical engineer, and my father's father was an accountant and had gone to Tufts. So I had a history of college education, and I can only say that that put me in the position of course you're going to school, which is not a luxury that's afforded everyone, and that isn't a question of affluence, but simply of background. I went to Mount Holyoke College, which I enjoyed tremendously, did some graduate work at the Boston University, and some occasional other sorts of schooling here and there.
When you graduated college, finally, what did you do after? Did you go into some other career first?
I started out by going to the Radcliffe Secretarial School, which I'm happy to say no longer exists. But that was an era when, for instance, women were not welcome into a number of professions. Yeah. I was, in fact, an economics minor, and I very much was interested in business and thought about something like, Merrill Lynch or whatever. Their junior executive training program did not admit women. And so the ordinary course was to, pick up some skills and become invaluable in that respect. And people who were in that secretarial school were from all the best schools. And I then went on to Houghton Mifflin, where I was a secretary, and everyone up and down the aisle were, Smith, Connecticut College, Wellesley, Bryn Mawr, all the good schools. And I had an editor who happily was willing to give me additional things to do, and in time I became an assistant editor, and I was the first person in the textbook department who moved from being a secretarial position into an assistant editor position, which for a woman at that time was unusual. And so I will say that it's interesting, given the evolution of my career, how very different it is for young women graduating today. I think they face challenges, but they're rather different than the ones that my generation faced.
When did you first realize that you had a book bug?
Oh, I've always had a book bug. I mean, that for me was my continuum when I was a child. moving from place to place.
Yeah.
Reading was what made me whole is perhaps not quite the right word, but that was my home. That was my stasis. That was where I could always go to when I was dealing with yet another set of new school, new teacher, trying to, and that was sort of a constant. That newness was constant, and so for me, the books were always a wonderful resource. And my mother's problem was trying to keep up with my desire for the reading, the intake. So for me, it was a natural stream. I went through college first as an economics major and then became an English major. And as one of my professors said to me, "What saved you?" The fact I couldn't do math was part of it, but
probably.
But in any case, then I went into publishing, and from Houghton Mifflin I went to New York, and eventually decided I didn't want to stay in New York and came back. And I was fortunate enough that I had a friend who was a general used bookseller, Claire Murphy of Pace and Hall Books.
I know Claire very well.
And she and I were in high school together, as was my husband. We were all very good friends. Huh. And when I began working for Palmer and Dodge, which is a wonderful law firm, Claire kept saying, "Sarah, I think you would really love this." And that was the day when you could go down to Milk Street and, putz around, and you had those stores. You had the storefronts that were an education in of themselves. And, gradually I was persuaded that this could possibly be where I would want to become truly professional. And I did a little bit of self-education in a way. I spent a couple of years in retail working for Harvard bookstores. And at that point, I thought, having worked in publishing, having been a student, having worked in retail, both on the trade and on the textbook side, I had a reasonable knowledge of the market and some kind of understanding. My woeful ignorance in terms of the antiquarian book market, I did not understand, and I was fortunate because that ignorance allowed me the confidence to go forward, which I would not have had otherwise. But the great thing about the book business is the generosity of the people that you meet and the kind of knowledge that booksellers' catalogs, contain in them, so that by talking to booksellers and by reading their catalogs, there's a lot that, one can learn just there.
Sarah's reference to Milk Street is for Goodspeeds.
Yes.
On Milk Street. When we're talking back and forth, you and I know what you're talking about.
Yes.
But somebody who's going to be watching this video may not. So, those were the happy hunting grounds, though.
Absolutely. Yes.
And those days will never come back.
No.
What possessed you to move to North Carolina?
We're actually in Virginia, and I have to...
Virginia, excuse me.
No, that's quite all right. My husband was a federal employee, and he received a very good offer to come down and work in the Washington, D.C. area, which is something that most, federal employees, if they're good, that will happen. And it was a difficult move in the sense that we were moving away from our family. A fortunate move in the sense that it's been a wonderful place for us in terms of family, and also in terms of booking. It's a wonderful area.
A great area. Although this year's been a little tough winter-wise, hasn't it?
Oh, grim.
You got our weather this year. You're in the weather in Virginia.
24 inches of heavy, wet snow is no one's delight.
Oh, it's terrible. It's terrible. Sarah, what was the year that you established yourself as E. Wharton Books, and why did you use Edith Wharton as your nom de plume, so to speak?
1979. The year I tend to think of as the class of the Young Turks of Boston, because Priscilla Javelis and Waiting for Godot, Gary Olson, Helen Kelly, and Fran Ness, who was then Boston Book Company, somehow we all sort of spontaneously generated around that time, whereas always had been, pretty much, good speeds and
male-dominated booksellers, pretty much.
Pretty much. But, a good time to begin exposing other possibilities. And Edith Wharton, because I had read, and this is one of the instances in which a book really does change one's life. I read R.W.B. Lewis's biography of Edith Wharton, and what was interesting to me was I only knew a very small aspect of her career. I only knew 2 or 3 books, did not understand fully the curve of her career or the multiplicity of it. I didn't know that she had written a groundbreaking interior decoration book, decoration of houses. I didn't know that she had written travel books. She wrote one of the, first travel books for automobiles, Motor Flight Through France. She wrote that wonderful Italian villas and their gardens. I didn't know anything about her war work in France, which was really extraordinary and for which she received the Legion of Honor. And it struck me at the time that she was really emblematic of any number of extraordinary, talented women writers who were simply invisible in terms of the academic landscape. And mind you, when I went through school, the only woman writer that I formally studied while I was there was Emily Dickinson.
Well, that's most people do, don't they?
And that was the academic canon at the time. That would not happen today.
No.
But that certainly represented the kind of myopia that was prevalent. I mean, literally, there were any number of women writers that just weren't on the horizon. And so Edith Wharton, E. Wharton & Co. was a little bit of a rift of Shakespeare and Company, who I admired as a bookseller.
Yeah.
And I will say that it's been both a good choice and a bad choice, because people will come up and say, "Oh, Mrs. Wharton."
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's,
But in any case, it also has meant that, and I should have been prepared, but I've been a little bit more intimately involved with Edith Wharton works than I would have originally anticipated, but the pleasure is that she survives closer scrutiny, so to speak.
Yeah. Who are some of the other people who were like mentors or people you could go to for advice when you first started in the trade?
Well, I think Priscilla was always very generous and wonderful and important and a good resource, and any number of other people. I mean, I was just mentioning to someone that the first time I visited an ABA bookseller, it was Burt Babcock.
Yes. Bert's a good guy.
Yeah, he is. And he sat down and he said, you should send catalogs to, and he wrote out a short list of 5 schools. Amongst them was Cornell, which, as you recall, was buying heavily at the time. And that was a very, very generous thing to do. And I didn't understand at the time really quite how generous it is to share a client. But I think that very much speaks to the kind of collegiality of the trade.
Absolutely, without a question. Now that you are the president of the ABAA, and you're going to be giving up a portion of your life that you don't even know about yet, what is your mantra? What do you're coming into office, and you must have some idea of what you'd like to see happen during your administration. Have you formulated that as yet?
spent a fair amount of thinking at Stuart's eloquent prompting. My first instinct is for assessment of looking at what we're doing now and how might we do better. Never overlook the obvious, I think, is a simple thing, and I think too often we do. It concerns me, for instance, that the ABA directory looks nothing like a program for an ABA book fair in California. And my sense is that someone should be able to pick up one and pick up the other as the same way that you would a Coke bottle and know instantly what you have. And there are other sorts of things, such as membership, which people are concerned about. And I think membership, I feel, is a larger question of our relating ourselves more formally and effectively with regional bookseller organizations such as Myriad, which certainly nurtured me as a bookseller. Yeah. And, I know you're a member of it.
Yes, have been since it began.
Yeah. And I think we need to find more ways that they better understand us, that they have better access to resources that would make sense for us to share. One of the things that I've suggested, for instance, to our security committee is to work with regional bookseller organizations to extend the security alert system so that if there is books that are stolen at a Myriad book fair, that it not only goes over their network and our network and vice versa. That isn't, you aren't just relying on sort of an informal connection, and by that and other means of making them feel that they're already connected to us and have greater access to us.
How do you respond to the criticism that our organization is a bunch of graybeards and gray hairs, and that my estimate, more than 50% of our organization is over 60?
Well,
where are we heading, Sarah, with this kind of a membership?
I happily, as membership chair, I've had a chance over the last 4 years to see applicants coming through, and my own experience is that it's twofold. There are a number of people who come to the ABA as a second profession.
Right.
And it's difficult for me to assess because I'm not sure how different that has been from the past. My sense is that probably, given the that there are fewer and fewer brick and mortar stores, that it may be more of the case that people come as a second profession because there are fewer opportunities to have it as a career all the way through. And so there may be a set of booksellers that have shorter careers than has been necessarily true of the past. That doesn't mean that they're going to be any less vital or interesting or able to contribute to the trade. The upside is that many of those older and second career people come better capitalized, and they're going to have a more stable business and a more mature business sense than a younger bookseller. On the other hand, I can attest that we do have younger booksellers coming through, and Lauren Baer and Brian Cassidy and Kevin Johnson, Harper Levine, they're there. And I think the real test, and we don't know what the long range is going to be. But I'm convinced that as long as there's antiquarian books, and I am a believer that that's going to continue, that people will continue to come into the trade. And what we need to do is to be more aggressive in developing interest in book collecting, which is something that we're starting to do. We need to be more aggressive in terms of both making available education opportunities, not only to nascent booksellers, but to young associates and younger members within the association. So I think we need to do more about that.
What is your personal business experience with the internet? Are you an internet person? Do you have your inventory there? Do you do a certain percentage of your business via the internet?
The internet is like a little rain from heaven at unexpected times.
Well
I admire what Between the Covers and Tom Conlon and Dan Gregory do. That is not my native way of operating. And it took my son, who, 5 to 10 years to persuade me to put up a website. I think all of us of our generation have had that experience of grappling with all computerization, software, internet, and we come to it without the kind of native ease that other generations do. But we learn, and I think its potential is great. It's a visual medium, and when you are able to combine a good written description with good images, that certainly is more persuasive, I think, than just a verbal description alone.
Which is one of the reasons why we're doing these video interviews. So we can see who you are, see the expression on your face when a question's asked, and have a feeling for the individual by watching them respond. I think all of us of our generation came kicking and screaming into the internet, and then now all of us are saying the same thing. It's like you said, it's pleasant rain from heaven. What do you see as some of the main challenges that we face as booksellers in the upcoming 5 or 10 or 15 years?
The most immediate is the economy. I don't think that we're going to see a quick change, a quick turnaround. I think that there are some very serious stresses and that came into play in the downturn, and I don't see that changing for a while. And I think that booksellers are going to have to be very alert and very careful. At the same time, not completely abandoning. We all take risks. Every single time we buy a book, we take a risk.
Absolutely.
And so I think we're going to have to be very agile. I'm less worried about the impact of Kindle digital books for our generation for the next 5 to 10 years. The next 10 to 20 years, it will be interesting because that will be a generation who did not go to the library in college, but worked through online resources. My son is a reader, but he spent very little time in libraries when he was in college. So it'll be a different sensibility. At the same time, I think we have to remind ourselves, Mike, what were people collecting when you first came into the trade?
Not what they're collecting now, Sarah, that's for sure.
No. There wasn't ephemera.
Right.
There wasn't African American.
Right.
Very little women.
Virtually no women.
So I think that every single time we envision there are going to be enormous changes, we don't know if that's an enormous change that's going to collapse or expand or just simply, move things around. And it's interesting, when you have people like Tom Conlon and Ken Lopez, who really changed what a first edition was, what that market could include. I don't imagine that. Joseph the Provider was always the gold standard of modern first editions.
In its time.
In its time. And Tom changed that market.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are other young booksellers who are changing the markets in other
Yes.
areas as well.
Yeah.
The only problem I have is there are not enough of them. I mean, when you think in terms of what our membership is, that for 40 years we had a burgeoning membership that was up to almost 550 members. And now it's slowly but surely going down to what, 450 now?
450.
And I think that all of us here in the association want to see that number go back up without losing any of the credibility or any of the integrity that goes along with it.
I completely agree with you.
I just don't know how to do it, that's all.
I don't think there's a single answer.
Well, in any case, we can always pray for better times. Our time is up. Enjoyed our conversation.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for participating. And go sell some books.
Oh, thank you.